Okay, as I say, welcome everyone to the second Tree Rings webinar as part of this year's Urban Tree Festival on blossom and bloom, the significance of flowering trees. It's great that so many have been able to join us on a rather pleasant Sunday afternoon, at least in London it is anyway. And we have a great lineup of speakers for you this afternoon, so there's a lot to look forward to. I'm Neil Sinden from CPRE London, which is the London branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and we've been curating this webinar series. We're delighted that we've got a great lineup for you. Before introducing them, I just wanted to say a few things by way of housekeeping. I'm sure people now generally are quite familiar with the Zoom webinar format, but in case you're not, you'll see in the chat bar, which you can click on in the middle of your screen at the bottom, that there's already some information being shared about the Urban Tree Festival, and we'll be sharing further information about speakers and this particular event and topic as we go through the session on the chat bar. We're asking people to post questions in the Q&A panel, which you can click on at the bottom right of your screen, we'll get to the questions after the speakers at the end of each of the speakers. Well, at the end of once all of the speakers, should I say, have finished their presentations. I wanted to say thank you so much for coming along today, and thank you if you've managed to donate to the Urban Tree Festival before coming here. This is a festival that's largely run by volunteers, so if you haven't donated and if you enjoy the session this afternoon, please do so. We are, however, grateful for the sponsorship that we have received from the Mayor of London, Trees for Cities, the Woodland Trust, but nonetheless, these events really are being put on essentially by volunteers. So any donations you can provide would be put to good use. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Helen Firminger, who will be kicking off the presentations this afternoon. Helen is a warden at the South London Botanical Institute, which you might say something more about, I don't know. But she's going to introduce the topic. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks. Hi. Yes, so I'm representing South London Botanical Institute today, which is a lovely resource in South London, which has a wonderful range of talks online at the moment. Just a little plug for those. So do look up the website and look up some of those. I'm privileged to have worked with a lot of amazing charities as ecologist, artist, consultant and educator, and some of you might know me from some of those. Hello. Form and function, that's something that I'm really interested in relation to starting this topic. I've got lots of flowers. I've got lots of tree flowers today, which I'm going to show. So you might want to go to speaker view if you're not already on it, just to make everything bigger. I would love to do this as a 1-hour workshop with all of us around a table where we can pass things around, and maybe one day we will. But in the meantime, hopefully just to tip a little bit of curiosity to go and look at some tree flowers. Forgive me if I tell you things you already know. It means we're all still on the baseline. So first off, I just grabbed some rhododendron because it was the biggest flower I could find to start talking about flowers. Biggest flower that's vaguely on a tree. Obviously, it's not native. It is a bisexual flower, like most of the flowers. Vast majority of flowers in the world are bisexual because it makes sense to them to have their male and female organs close together. So I've taken one off here. Here's one individual flower from the rhododendron. And what we got around the outside is the bit that attracts the pollinator, which might be bees or might be birds with a rhododendron in India or China. This bit around the outside, I'm going to take it off so you can see the bit in the middle, which is the male and female sexual bits. So here we've got the stamens, the filament and anther at the top, which has got all the pollen in, which is what the bee wants to get to, or the bird, get some pollen, and then they might accidentally go on the female bit, which is that bit at the top, which will ultimately make the seed. So that's the same with many, many of our flowers that I'm going to talk about. But I thought I'd go to the different ones first. So about a quarter of our native trees are wind pollinated. They're not pollinated by bees or butterflies, and that means as the wind blows over the male flowers, it will pick the pollen up from those, and then it'll happen to blow over some of the female flowers, preferably on a different tree. Some of them time their opening to make it possible for that to happen. So this is an oak. I think it's pinnate oak. Our native oaks are going over now. They've gone past this, and most of the wind pollinated trees, for some reason, they put their flowers out before their leaves. Could it be to allow the wind to blow through them more freely? Quite possibly. So if you're looking at hazel flowers, those beautiful catkins in springtime, they're the male flowers of the hazel. Birch, beech, ash, alder, they've all got catkins as their male flowers, which will produce pollen, which goes over to the female flowers, which in many of those trees you can hardly see, but here on the oak you can see what's going on here. I'll say they've all got this very long, thin catkiny format, makes it much easier to do it, to have the wind blow over them. I found an ash. Yeah, there's a tiny bit of ash flower left in there. You can't really see it actually because most of this is going over, but there is a tiny bit of ash flower left in there. Yeah, being the rest of them are turning into their little ash seeds now. As I say, most of the wind pollinated flowers come out in spring, early spring. Moving on from that one, I've got 10 plants, by the way. I've got 10 minutes and 10 plants, so I might even come in under 10 minutes. Willow's obvious. Here's some willow. It's one of the ones that flowers very early in the year because it is partly wind pollinated, but it's also bee pollinated. So it moves over from wind pollination to bee pollination, which means it's got the best of all worlds. And so if I can say it right, ambophilous. That is the word for the plants that are pollinated by both bees and the wind. And interestingly, they're starting to think that some of the flowering plants are also pollinated by both wind and bees. And I've got some lovely elder here. So the tiny elder flowers have got pretty similar structure to those big rhododendrons that I started with. But there's some suspicion that elderflowers are partly wind pollinated because they put a lot of pollen out into the wind. And I always say anything that's wind pollinated, of course, those of you with allergies, they're the ones that are most likely to be causing the tree allergy, the the runny nose, all that kind of thing, because the pollen's blowing around in the wind. Bee pollen is sticky. Which one should I go to next? Yeah. Let's have these. I think it's quite good to have a look at these because these are so dominant in our treescape at the moment, and they're very, very important if you're interested in supporting pollinating insects, which are probably peaking at the moment. And there's a theory that one of the reasons that we do so well for things like honey in London is because we have a lot of tree flowers, and the horse chestnut is a wonderful one. I can smell it. Well, I could smell it from over there, but I can really smell it from over here. Let's take an individual flower off the panicle. Again, what we got here, we've got, that's not an individual flower, that's an individual flower. So again, you can't really see, but you've got the stamens and the stigma and style there. So you've got the male and female parts in one flower. You've got this beautiful brightly coloured petal. Well, it's got brightly coloured lines on it, which will help to attract the bees. And they'll be going down to the nectar at the bottom and accidentally brushing against the pollen up here and carrying it round to help pollinate those to create horse chestnuts. So that tiny little flower is ultimately, this little bit at the base of it is going to turn into a horse chestnut, which is brilliant. Yeah. Okay, I talked about most of them being bisexual. Obviously, the wind-pollinated ones are not bisexual. They're what they call monoecious. They've got the male and female flowers separately. Then there's some which are actually dioecious. This is holly. I picked some that didn't have very spiky leaves for my own comfort. I don't know if anyone's done any research into what pollinates holly. It has the male and female flowers separately. It seems to do quite well at burying even in the shade. And I am actually holding one female and one male. And for those of you with good screen resolution, I'll show you what we're looking at. You may not be able to see it on here, but at least it gives you a chance to go and look for yourself. So let's take them right up to the camera. So I've got a female one on this side and a male one on this side. So the female one, as you can see, it's got a little green bubble in the middle of it, which I think is getting bigger because it's probably being pollinated. But the small bubble in the middle of it, which is the bit that's going to turn into the berry, is what tells you if you've got a female holly. And the male one has just got those 4 stamens sticking out at the top of it. So if you're walking past a holly profuse with flowers and you're feeling a little bit curious, have a close look and see if it's got a bubble in the middle of it. Just show you that one again. In the middle of the petals, little green blob, which means it'll be a berrying holly, or if not, and you can always go back 6 months later and see if you were right. Yeah, I'll go to the blossom. So it was really hard finding anything which might traditionally be called blossom in my neighbourhood. This is the apple tree. It was really hard because we've had a lot of rain and wind recently, and I think this was the only bit left on that tree. Again, it's bisexual. It's got both sexes in one flower. The petals come off really easily. The petals are there to attract the pollinating insects, and then you can just about ring of many stamens and a double stigma and style at the middle. Again, have a look at your own. This bit at the bottom here is what's ultimately going to turn into the apple after the bee has taken the pollen from there over to there. And I'm just going to pause and think about blossom for a minute. And what is blossom? Why do we call it blossom? So we've got 3 words. We've got blossom, bloom, and flower. And all of those originally meant flower in the terms we use it now. They mean the flowering parts on a plant, but they came from different places. So the word flower that we use now came from France with the Normans and into our language, and that's the one we most commonly use. Bloom came from Iceland with presumably the Vikings, and blossom came with the Anglo-Saxons from an Anglo-Saxon word. So it seems that a word which has really entered particularly the agricultural world, the orchard keepers, we talk about blossom, we talk about blossom rot and things like that, is the Anglo-Saxon word, presumably because the Anglo-Saxons were the ones managing the orchards, and then the Normans came in with this fancy new word, flower. So you could use all of them to mean any flower, the oak flower or anything like that, but because of the way the agricultural world has taken that word blossom, we tend to use it to mean the flowers on a fruit tree, and sometimes on other productive trees that produce things that we're going to eat. So that tends to be where it goes. So I'll just finish, say quick whiz, as I said, around many of the different flower types, but just remember they're not always so sometimes they do weird and wonderful things with their parts. So the rhododendron that we started with, when I took this bit off, it's not petals, it's one great big sepal at the bottom there that's taken the colour, like the bougainvillea has the same thing, and it's all fused, and when you see how easily the petals fall off the apple tree, you can think maybe it's quite sensible for a rhododendron to have one big solid one there that won't fall off, because it can make sure it has multiple pollinators. And I've got some lovely Azara here from the tree at the Botanical Institute in the garden. And the Azara, again, I can really smell it, beautiful vanilla scent. It didn't bother with petals. This, see, I don't have anything to pull off here. It's just a great mass of stamens with a style in the middle. So there's no petals there, because the golden stamens are so attractive anyway that the bees can find them. And again, that may be because it's giving itself a little bit of a chance at being wind pollinated too. I think I'll finish there. Oh, one last one. Watch out for the petals that have when you get the double flowered ones, like another one that they'd all blown off in the wind, so I can't show you, but when you get the double flowered cherries and things like that, that usually means that there aren't any stamens and style in the middle. There's no nectar, there's nothing for the bees. They look gorgeous, but they're not going to produce fruit or be useful to the bees. And I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Helen, for a fantastic introduction. That was a wonderful run through of some of the more common tree flowers that we see around, and I'm particularly interested in your brief reference to the etymological origins of the words that we're using. Very interesting indeed. So we're going to save up questions for later on. So if you have any questions for Helen, please place them in the Q&A panel. We're going to move straight over now to Russell Miller, who is well known to many tree people, and was a founder, amongst other things, a founder member of the Hackney Tree Musketeers, who are very well known in this neck of the woods, should I say. Over to you, Russell.
Thank you. Thanks for that brilliant introduction to tree flowers, Helen. That was really useful. I'm going to talk about wildlife and blossom, and using the Anglo-Saxon term in its loosest sense. Yeah, I'm an arboriculturalist and an ecologist, so I'm interested in trees and particularly invertebrates associated with trees, but generally ecology and everything wild. So let me just work out how to forward my presentation. So what did you expect on blossom? Well, obviously you're going to expect bees. This is a common carder bee on apple blossom. Everyone knows that bees pollinate flowers, and that there's an interrelationship between bees and flowering trees. It's important to realize that honeybees are only one of those species that pollinates, and that there are 270 plus species of bee in the UK. So it's important to remember it's not just all about honeybees. The bumblebees tend to be better at flying in cold temperatures. So a lot of the work that's going to be done at the moment, because we've got really quite cold weather, is going to be done by bumblebees and some of the solitary bees. But that's a very common bumblebee. You'll see common carder bee pretty much everywhere, and that's it, nectaring at the moment on blossom, on apple blossom. Another very common bee, the tree bumblebee. This was new to the UK about, I think came in about 2000, now pretty much all over the UK. Easy to recognise because it's got ginger on its thorax, dark on most of the abdomen, and then a pale tail. So a nice triple coloured, quite easy to recognise bee. This one is on cherry plum, and cherry plum is an important species for early pollinators because it flowers very early. It's not native, but it's very common. With climate change, with things being very uncertain in terms of when spring is going to happen, when is it going to be warm, when is it going to be cold, cherry plum is a very useful plant to have around so that any early pollinators that pop out have got something to feed on. And you will see lots of bees on cherry plum early in the season. So cherry plum will probably flower, well, certainly in London, it will even flower by late February usually. Often mistaken for sloe, blackthorn, but blackthorn flowers about a month later, usually. Flowering times do vary according to seasons. And this one's really exciting. So in addition to honeybees and bumblebees, you've got the solitary bees. And new to the UK in 2016, I think, this bee was discovered. This is the European orchard bee, Osmia cornuta, one of the mason bees. So these live create their solitary nests in masonry or other horizontal structures. So they may use bee hotels. If you put out a bee hotel, you might get an early European orchard bee. They're probably a little bit more common than we realize because they're very similar to a native bee, the red mason bee. And they're a bit more distinctive in that they're very black and orange. The red mason bee has less black on it. And these fly very early. So this is Osmia cornuta on cherry plum again. And this, I think, was taken in February. So the very early flyer, and another reason why they're probably missed and slightly under-recorded. But really exciting, a new bee to the UK. This is Hawthorne Mining Bee. So the mining bees are the ones that nest in the ground. Again, one of the solitary groups. So honeybee is one species, bumblebees is about 25 species in the UK, and the other 250 odd are all solitary bees. And this is a Hawthorne mining bee on bird cherry. Because the Hawthorne mining bee doesn't know it's a Hawthorne mining bee, it just happens to pop out around about the time that hawthorn is in flower, which is why it's been given the common name Hawthorne mining bee. But you have to be a little bit careful with the common names. They don't necessarily tell you what you think they're telling you. So a Hawthorne mining bee will be perfectly happy on bird cherry, or anything else that's flowering around that time. And it's not all about bees. This is a fly, although it looks a bit like a bee. It's actually a fly that parasitizes bees. So it's known as a bee fly, or more specifically, a dark-edged bee fly. I also call these Dumbo flies because they've got a very long proboscis. And this one's got its long proboscis in a Japanese cherry flower at the moment. So it's nectaring on a Japanese cherry. And it's very furry, so it will get pollen on its fur, and it will pollinate. So don't assume that just bees are the only ones involved in pollinating. Lots of flies are involved in pollinating. And this is a parasitic fly which will actually hover over solitary mining bee nests and flick its eggs into the nest. It's really quite bizarre, but you will see these very, very common on warm days hovering about, rather like hoverflies. And there are beetles involved as well. This is a very small longhorn beetle, named because of its long antennae. There's about 40 species of longhorn beetle in the UK, I think. This is probably the smallest one. So this is a tiny longhorn beetle in the middle of an apple flower. So you can see it's resting on the stamens. And you can see it's covered in pollen. Right on its head, it's got some pollen. So beetles are also involved in pollination. And obviously it's there to get nectar because nectar provides energy, and what they want is the energy in order to help them fly so that they can go and find a mate. Because remember, most adults in the insect community are dispersal and reproduction vehicles. Most of the eating, most of the growing takes place at a larval stage. So this is actually a deadwood species. So the larvae of this longhorn beetle live in dead twigs and eat dead wood. But they need the nectar in order to fly so they can go and find a mate, or they can go and find a new place to live. Likewise, apple sawfly. This is an apple sawfly on the left on a emerging apple blossom. The apple sawfly will lay its eggs on the blossom. The larvae will eat its way into the flower and then eat its way into the developing fruit. And eventually you get a big chunky larvae like this caterpillar-like thing on the right. And that larvae will eat its way out of a small apple. This is an early season species, so unlike codling moth, which eats its way through mature apples, you're not likely to find one of these in an apple if you're biting into one, because these will have long left the apple. And actually what happens is the trees drop the apples because the larvae particularly eat the protein-rich developing seeds in the center of the apple. And once the seed has gone from the center of the apple, there's no point in the tree retaining it. So sawflies are related to bees and wasps, very loosely related. They're in Hymenoptera, the same order, but they don't have a waist. So if you're trying to tell a wasp and a bee from a sawfly, Sawflies don't have that tight waist that you see on bees and wasps. And apple fruit weevil. This is, like the last species, these used to be sort of considered pests in commercial orchards, but I see them as actually wonderful biodiversity assets in community orchards in London. And if you're lucky, you might see one of these species. They're all fairly small. This is probably about 10 millimeters, so it's quite a small insect. But this one sitting on an apple blossom, probably sitting there waiting to find a mate. It being spring, that's what it's up to. But these, again, like the apple sawfly I just showed you, the larvae, the eating stage, develops inside a young apple fruit. And just to emphasize that the flies do get involved, this is a common drone fly, called a common drone fly because it looks a little bit like a honeybee male, a drone. This is on cornelian cherry. So to remember that apple flowers don't just, tree flowers are considerably more diverse than just the rosacea fruit flowers that we're used to calling blossoms, such as cherry and apple and pear. There's loads of flowers on different species of tree. And cornelian cherry isn't a cherry, it's a cornus, so it's in a completely different family. But you can see clearly there are stamens there, and you can actually see that the fly is nectaring around the stamen, so it's getting nectar from the flowers. And a lot of pollination is done by flies, and flies play an important role in pollination services. So you can see on the back of this insect, there's lots of pollen on its back. So they do a lot of the work. It's not just the bees. And then finally, just to finish up, you can't really talk about flowers on trees and insects without talking about the BB tree. This tree has so many names, it's quite difficult to pin it down. So even the scientific name, Tetraedium danielii, there's about 3 different scientific names. It's also known as Korean Euodia, and yeah, loads of names for this tree. But you will see this on streets in Hackney, and you will see it on streets elsewhere. And when it flowers in June, this is a later flowering species, it gets covered in bees. And there are actually at least 2 honeybees in that photograph. You may or may not see them, but you will hear this tree when it's in flower because it will be covered in bees. So there's a huge diversity of insects and a huge diversity of trees involved in pollination and biodiversity. I've just given you a really brief overview. I hope that was interesting, and do look at your trees and notice the insects. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Russell. Fantastic, as you say, canter through just some of the interesting and useful wildlife associated with tree flowers, and some fantastic images. So thank you so much for those. Excellent. We're going to move swiftly on now to Annie Reilly from the National Trust, who is going to broaden the topic slightly and I think talk a bit more to us about the National Trust perspective on tree blossom and perhaps the cultural associations of tree flowers. Over to you, Annie.
Hello, thank you. Can you all see my screen, and can you all hear me?
I certainly can.
Great. So yes, it was fantastic to hear a little bit about the science and the ecology of blossom, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the cultural value of it, and a little bit about our National Trust Blossom program, which is very much about bringing people closer to trees, and that's literally and metaphorically. And it's very much about the connection between people and nature and the value of that connection for both. It's a multi-year, multifaceted initiative that seeks to embed blossom season into our cultural consciousness through planting and a range of ways for people to take part and get involved. The origins of the program were really in March 2020 when we launched a social media campaign, a new social media campaign, which was #BlossomWatch. Now, which we obviously didn't know in advance, it completely coincided with lockdown. And we were struck by the high levels of engagement and also about the type of engagement we had. It was very clear that there was a real resonance to blossom, as there was to much of nature last year. And we were really struck by the way that people were finding solace and comfort and meaning and joy in blossom that was helping them deal with and process the very complex experience that we've all been through over the last year. And of course, at the same time, lockdown really highlighted the inequality of access to high quality green space, which is a thing that's very, very important to us as a charity and was important to our founders. And alongside that, we began thinking about what our role might be in marking the pandemic, and really more crucially in ensuring that we continue to contribute to the things that matter to us and that we think matter to people, and that will help us come back stronger from this experience. And that is, quite frankly, history, nature, and beauty for everyone forever. And it was from all of these moments, these things coming together, that came our Blossom initiative. Now, there are two main components to it. The planting of blossom trees, often in a circular formation on our own land and in partnership with others off our land. And these trees have this amazing moment, this real crescendo in the spring, but we really want to create spaces and plantings that are beautiful and useful throughout the year for the people who live near them. And alongside that, a wide-ranging cultural program, which includes the building of our #Blossom Watch campaign, activity at National Trust places, as well as things that people can do wherever they are to help them connect with Blossom and with each other. And people are entirely at the heart of this program. As you can see, I chose these images in part because we were reminded of how much blossom, there's not enough of it, we want there to be more, but it does exist near to where people live. It's the sort of program you don't need to come to a National Trust place to take part in. And we really wanted that to be at the heart of this. We wanted this to be accessible and about people. And also alongside that, at the heart of this program is partnership. We can't do any of this alone. And the first partnership that we developed has been with the Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority. And we've been working together on a planting project to create a new blossom garden in the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And that site was chosen because it has national significance and also because it has real local resonance. It's near the site of the Nightingale Hospital. It's bordered by a lot of boroughs that were disproportionately affected. And we felt that it could have real local resonance and national relevance. And we worked with some brilliant landscape architects, Edible Bus Stop and Davies White. And we also worked with a local community arts organization called Rosetta Arts, who helped us engage some of the local community in informing the tone and the feel of it. This is a sketch of what the space looks like. I'm not going to say a whole lot about the design because you're going to hear from one of the designers in a minute, but I just want to reflect that for us as the National Trust, it was really an ideal site because it's near to some very, very busy places, but it's also tucked away, so it can be a bit of an oasis. And also because, as I said, it has that real opportunity to mean something and be useful to local people, but also mean something and be useful to people who visit from anywhere else. It will launch at the end of May in just over a week, and there's going to be a program of activity throughout the summer going into the autumn, including some community planting days. And as I said, this has a real resonance and has a real commemorative aspect. This site is very much about honouring the experience of Londoners throughout this pandemic, and also about honouring key workers and those who we've lost. In addition to the site in London, we are working with partners in Newcastle, Nottingham and Plymouth on some further plantings this year. These are a couple of artist sketches of what they may look like. We're currently finalising sites and consulting with the community. And as you can see, some of these will probably be circular formation, but some of them will be other formations of plantings, whatever is right for the local site and the local people. There will also be planting at National Trust sites throughout the year of blossom trees that involving community and partners in it. And beyond planting, this year the activities included the growth of our #Blossom Watch campaign, which has been a real success. It's had over 6 million engagement numbers, and on what we declared the first National Blossom Watch Day at the end of April, it trended as #1 on Twitter. We also had some really reassuring and really exciting positive media coverage, and there's also been activity at our places as well as things that you can do at home. You can see here's a couple of examples examples. So for instance, in the bottom left, Modesfont, which is in Hampshire, did some origami that people could pause and do underneath the blossom, and as well as having a trail of the blossom. And I think it's fair to say that we have real ambitions for this program, and we want to grow it, both the planting and the cultural program. And the trees that we're planting will have a really key role to play in our wider woodland ambitions, our wider woodland creation ambitions. But it's important to note that it's very much about people and involving them in the creation and the use of these spaces, and providing opportunities to connect with others and with nature, to offer a chance each year to come together, to reflect on the experience of the pandemic and our need for nature, and to celebrate the hope and renewal of spring through the annual wonder, the annual spectacle that is blossom. It's also a chance to connect with the quiet, simple awe of nature, which is always there, no matter what crisis we find ourselves in. And on that note, I'm going to leave you with our brand film, which was our TV and advertising this year, which I think really neatly captures that ever-present value and beauty of nature. Oops, it hasn't worked. Bear with me. I will try and go back and make it work. There we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie. That fantastic explanation of the National Trust approach to this, and I think it's great to see attention being given to this. Perhaps in a few years' time we'll be more like the Japanese and their cherry blossom watch, which is internationally understood and known. But we'll come back to that perhaps in the questions. So last up is Michaela Gilchrist, who, as you've heard, is a founder of the Edible Bus Stop Consultancy and has been involved in the Olympic Park Blossom Rings scheme. So over to you, Mac.
Hello. Well, firstly, Annie, how can I follow that bee and those blossoms? That's a really tough act to follow. But I will endeavour with sharing my screen to discuss the London Blossom Garden, which I was very fortunate to collaborate with Andre Davis and Adam White of Davis White Landscape Architects, our clients being the National Trust, the Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority. As Annie has already said, this is a very significant site. It's the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. I just wanted to show you the Google view of it so you can get a flavour of its very unusual site. Andre likened it to looking like a pair of cupping hands. And so as you see, there's two slopes, one more slope than the other on the right-hand side of this picture, with existing established planting. And down the centre is a swale, which is a very boggy area. And as Annie mentioned, we did respond to community engagement regarding what the tone of the site might look like, and accessibility needs and wanting a place to sit and reflect was very important. So this also influenced our hard landscaping elements of the site. Here's some pictures of the existing perennials that we took on our site visit in October. Absolutely stunning, as is the planting throughout the Olympic Park. And we are working with those perennials and bringing them further into the lawn site as well. But as you see, it wasn't really a site that was truly accessible for those, for instance, in wheelchairs or, for instance, people with buggies. So our concept design was to create 3 rings, or in totaling 33 trees. There is a significance in the 33 being chosen as they represent the 32 boroughs of London and the City of London. So this is really the London Blossom Garden. Annie talks about the significance of tree rings, and that was very important for me to create that meaning within the site. And we decided that the best way to approach this was to create 3 separate rings. One ring of 7 on the perennial slope, one smaller ring of 5 at the other end of the site on the lawned area, and then one ring of 21 that would sweep across, go back to the previous slide, over both sides of the site. So here we go. Here's we considered many options in regards to what trees we chose. Do we go for the big hanami moment, you know, the Japanese celebration of cherry blossoms, where they're all blooming at the same time, or do we create a longer season? And so this is what we decided to do, was to go with the longer season, and also consider year-round interests and berries in autumn, for instance. These are the trees that were selected. It's a total of 8 different species: hawthorn, crabapple, and cherry plum, in fact. And as you see, that they're all stunners, but I'm pretty much all blossom trees are amazing, but these are really amazing. Some of them have red leaves, some of them have the most spectacular crimson blossoms, and others are just incredibly profuse. As we've seen since planting them, they have a season roughly of around 5 weeks, 6 weeks, but that really depends on the weather. So here you see that this is, we got quite established trees. They're about 4.5 meters tall. So they required quite heavy digging equipment to plant. And this is when we started having them planted by the contractors ID Verdi in March. And you can see from that top middle image, the swale there, exactly how boggy the site gets, and why we really did have to consider how to make this site fully accessible. We did this by creating a path that ran all the way through the site. It is a high content of recycled concrete, which is then stamped with a timber stamp. Interspersed along this path, there are 33 bands, again, nodding to the 33 trees in the 33 boroughs. 30 of these bands are reclaimed tropical timber from sites within London, and 3 of them, as you can see from that top right-hand photograph, are a high content of recycled marble aggregate, along with these bespoke benches, which I co-designed with a local artisan, Junior Phipps, who has his workshop just 5 minutes away in Hackney Wick. And these benches also feature reclaimed tropical timber from London sites, including the Olympic Park's former locks fenders, interestingly enough. So they are very local. Everything about this site has been considered for London and London's sake. And that bottom area, the bottom picture there, shows how the tree ring of 7 on the perennial side does actually all blossom at the same time. And each one of these benches is placed in front of one of the rings, so you can really enjoy the rings, the trees being framed in front of you. And each of these benches has an ability for a wheelchair to park next to it, or a buggy, and subject to the ability of the user to be able to slide over and be able to have an armrest to use. This is the site as it is now. That was last week. The lawn has grown back in. We are looking forward to it's still very low, but the wildflower meadow that has been planted around, in a swathe around the bigger circle in the middle on the lawn side, actually taking on it. Of course, the cold weather has not been conducive to it growing that quickly. As Annie mentioned, in autumn, in September, there will be some perennial planting at the site and lots of activities throughout the summer. I'm really looking forward to the opening and actually watching people populate it and seeing how people react and relate to the site. And I hope it's a real success. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mac. That was really interesting to see to hear about the thinking behind the scheme. And I have to say that I'm actually sitting not too far away from the site in question, and I've been very interested to see it evolve, and can't wait to get in there actually when it's eventually open. So thanks for that. We've had a brilliant series of talks, really just scratching the surface of the wildlife and botanical and cultural significance of tree blossom. We're going to spend a few minutes now looking at the Q&A panel and answering some of your questions. Please, if you have any other questions that you want to throw at the panelists, now's the time to do so. And I'm going to kick off by just picking two questions in the panel, which are asking about bees. I think, Russell, you talked about the European orchard bee being new to the UK, and Becky Lyon is asking, how did it get here? And then there's a further question from Catherine on bees, where she says, there were bees nesting under my shed 2 years ago, but they haven't returned. Any idea why? So, I mean, Russell, I think you may be in the best position to pick these up, but any of the speakers, please feel free to chip in.
Okay, so new to the UK. Obviously, we don't actually know exactly how these things happen, but bees get blown around, and it's a European species, so it almost certainly came over the channel either wind assisted or under its own speed, and it probably has done that numerous times over the decades, but it's not managed to survive in previous years because it's a very, very early species, and it's probably been too cold in previous years for it to establish. So what we're seeing is an introduction, probably a natural introduction, which is now succeeding as a result of climate change and the increasing temperatures in London, partly associated with climate change and partly associated with the urban heat island effect. So that's not a definitive answer, because it is possible that somehow it came on a truck or in a train, or but it's very likely a natural introduction. Bees under sheds. I've got bees under my shed at the moment, so really topical bees under sheds question. So I've got buff-tailed mining bee, no, buff-tailed bumblebee nest under my shed. I don't know what bees were under your shed. I'm guessing they were bumblebees. Bumblebees tend to nest in old vole nests or old mouse nests, and they tend not to go back to the same place year on year, because if you do nest in the same place year on year, you're going to have the same parasites and a build-up of disease. So species tend to move around. It's remotely possible you could have had honeybees under your shed, but I think that's probably a bit unlikely, and you're probably a bit relieved that they have gone if they were honeybees. Yeah, generally bumblebees will not go back to the same nest, although solitary bees will use the same area but build new nests. So if you've got, for example, a kind of sunny bank, that you may find bees nesting in that year on year, but they're actually digging new nests each year.
Thanks, Russell. I don't know, Helen, whether you have any comments on that question, or shall we move on?
No, I'm waiting for the other insect one.
Okay, yeah. So we have thank you, Annie and Michaela. Just sort of chip in if you want to, or flag if you want to come in. I'll move on to another question from Afra Dasgupta, who says most ecologists really push for native trees as being the best for pollinators. What's your opinion on that? So maybe Helen, you can kick off on this one.
Yeah. No, I was hoping to, just having waved the horse chestnut around earlier. There's an awful lot of confusion around the native is best and the non-native is best and all the rest of it. And many years ago, there was charts of trees and the insect species that are related with them brought out. And if you look at those charts, oak is actually really high up and willow are really high up, but they're not insect pollinated anyway. And in many cases, particularly with the oak, a lot of those insects are associated with big standard oaks that have gone hollow in the middle and have got very local specialists in them, as you find in the New Forest and places like that. My personal favourite wildlife tree is probably hawthorn, and particularly as a nectar plant, because bees, you get flies, you get all sorts going on it, and then come the autumn, the big birds take the berries and the little birds are pecking around all winter looking for the insects hiding in cracks. So that is a wonderful native plant. But in nectar terms, there's also many non-natives that have bred in places where they really need to put it out to attract the bees. So they need a lot of scent and a lot of nectar and so on, and that brings insects from all over. So if it's just the pollinators you're looking at, then and just the bees, or maybe you're a beekeeper or something like that, you might want either a non-native, buddleia, even, you can go for it, butterflies, but very little the rest of the year, or a bred one like the apple. But if you're looking at a wider picture, sometimes native is a good place to start.
Thanks, Helen. Very, very good answer, good response. I'm going to pick up another question actually relating to behaviour of bees. This is from Peter Coles, and he asks, is it right that bees forage for nectar and that carrying and transferring pollen is accidental, though flowers evolved to encourage this? Bees don't carry pollen back to their nest hive, do they? Russell, perhaps you might want to pick this up.
Yeah, bees do carry pollen because pollen is the primary food source for the developing larvae. So what most insects and most bees are doing is they're nectaring on the flowers. And actually the National Trust video that Annie showed is a hoverfly nectaring on the flowers. You can actually see it licking up nectar as it walks across the flowers. And they use that to help them fly, because it's rich in sugars and vroom, 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 it's like petrol. And then the pollen is deliberately collected by honeybees, bumblebees, and the solitary bees, which they collect usually on their scope or on their legs, but there are other mechanisms of collecting it. And they then deposit that in their nests to feed their young. So there is a deliberate active collection of pollen as well.
Thank you. Very interesting. So we'll perhaps move to a couple of questions that are more relevant to the presentations from Annie and Michaela. So from another from Afra Dasgupta, asking, I think, Matt, did you replace the SUDS, the Sustainable Urban Drainage Scheme drainage under the path in the Blossom Orchard? You mentioned it was very boggy, and perhaps you can say a bit more about how you've dealt with that. And then there's another question relating to the London Blossom Garden from Conchita, who asks, is the wildflower meadow made up of native wildflowers?
In answer to the first question, yes, ID Verdi, the contractors, handle the SUDS element, and we actually consulted with a SUDS expert on that to make sure that we got that right. In answer to the question whether we use native, yes, let me just look that up. There are a total of 12 native wildflower species and 6 species of grass that will be planted in the species-rich lawn area.
Okay, great. Annie, I don't know whether you have anything to add to that.
I suppose just saying that there will be some perennials that will be planted, but they'll be later in the autumn. So, although we're very much there and we're looking forward to opening up the garden, but there will be some further planting happening in the autumn, won't there, Mac? Which will be involving local people in.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I think we just have so we have one other question in the Q&A panel, but I'm sure that listeners out there will have other questions. So please, we have a few more minutes left. So if you do want to pitch one in, please do so as soon as you can. But I'm going to ask, this is a perennial question, really. I think that's relating not just to the kind of issues that we've been talking about in terms of tree flowers this afternoon, but it's a question from Catherine, and it'll be interesting to see if any of the speakers have some assistance they can provide on this one. And she asks, I'm a volunteer tree planting coordinator in my local park. We get schools and community groups to plant, but there is ongoing vandalism affecting the trees. What do you advise to sort of help address this problem? As I say, it's a perennial issue, but I'm wondering if any of the speakers have some useful suggestions as to how to address that issue of vandalism. Helen is keen to respond.
I don't know. I'm sure Max got a lot of this as well, but I wasn't sure if it was whips. I mean, the implication is that it's whips, Catherine, that you're planting there. Feel free to put in the chat if it's not. And it's the whips that are getting vandalised, which sounds awful, and also sounds quite. It sounds like someone's deliberately trying to disrupt the tree planting programme, because that doesn't sound like random aggression when, you know, people attack full-grown trees or whatever. It sounds like someone's trying to disrupt it, which makes me wonder if there's somebody disgruntled in the local community who's doing it deliberately or something like that, that maybe a bit detective work might find out where it's coming from. If not, the other thing I was going to suggest, assuming it is whips, and depending on what end result you're trying to get, is maybe cutting them quite low so they're less obvious, and then they can regenerate, you know, the roots can get down, they can regenerate from the epicormic buds in a low coppice, but they're much less obvious. So hide them in plain sight, but let the roots get down. That's pretty well all I've got. But I'm hoping Mac's got some of her wonderful experience.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That doesn't sound right to me. It's very rare I've ever encountered that kind of vandalism. We've got an answer. Yes, they are whips. Well, that makes them very vulnerable. What I find is that you have got from your initial question, people involved. It's very important to get local and community involved with planting, because then that creates a vested interest in that site and people are protective over that site. It does beg the question if there is someone with some grudge to bear. And I'm so sorry to hear this. The only other thing I would suggest is if you, some protection around them, and maybe, again, as Helen said, a little bit of detective work, asking around who do you think is causing this. On the whole, I think it is thankfully rare that this happens, in my experience anyway.
Thank you, Mac and Helen. Annie and Russell, anything to add? No, Russell.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've been running Tree Musketeers for a long time, 20 years now, and vandalism is something that you do encounter, and it can vary from, you know, an individual incident that is just random and doesn't recur to slightly more systematic stuff. It does tend to depend quite a lot on locations, and by locations I mean where within the park you tend to plant. So for example, you plant next to a bench or next to a path, they tend to get a bit more vandalism because it's just passing traffic, if you like. With whips, it kind of begs the question, what is the site being used for? Is someone thinking the site should be used for something else? Are they thinking that the planting of the whips is inappropriate? You know, it's difficult to know without a bit more detail. One thing I would say, Catherine, is kind of keep at it. Vandalism is something that happens in urban environments for lots of different reasons. Sometimes it is a lack of community engagement, and it is disempowered people with certain ownership by being destructive, and that's not a kind of legitimization, but it's just a recognition that community engagement is important and difficult, and it's all very difficult if you're a volunteer because it takes a lot of work. Making sure that planting scheme is as widely publicised as possible before you get planting, and engaging as many people as possible in planting, but ultimately just don't give up, you know, keep at it. A lot of trees will survive quite a lot of brutal treatment. So if you try and get the kind of physiology stuff right, the watering or the weed control, particularly with whips, but good luck. Yeah, I mean, if you want to contact me off, you know, off Zoom, I can maybe give you a bit more advice if it's a London site that I know.
Thanks, Russell, and thanks to all of the speakers for answering those questions. Some very wise thoughts there. I think we're going to wrap up in a moment. It's been great to hear these presentations. I've been absolutely fascinated by all of them for different reasons, and I think hopefully, even though we're only able to scratch the surface of this very interesting topic, it's given you a lot of food for thought yourselves. Before closing down, I just wanted to say this is the first weekend of the Urban Tree Festival, which runs for another 7 days. We have an action-packed programme for people of all ages and backgrounds. We have obviously Tree Rings webinars happening on a daily basis around lunchtime for the rest of the week. I think tomorrow we have a session, if you're interested, to join us on the London Urban Forest Plan, which is a newly adopted document prepared by a range of organisations, including the Greater London Authority and the Forestry Commission, who've been in the lead, with lots of interesting ideas for how we can grow the urban forest in London. On Monday we have, on Tuesday we have a session on urban hedgerows, why they're important, and the rest of the programme you can see on the Urban Tree Festival website. One final plea, as I said at the start, you know, we're a largely volunteer-run festival. We depend on donations. Thank you to all of you who've donated in joining this webinar. If you haven't done so, and if you feel inspired to do so, you can go to the Urban Tree Festival website, and it's fairly easy to follow how to do that. And finally, I should say, on the website there is also a shop, and we don't have a lot of things to sell, but we do have a wonderful collection of poetry and prose related to trees and woods, and urban trees and woods, called Canopy, which you can order from the website, and that will also help support the festival and our future activities. So I'll leave it there. Thanks again hugely to Mac, Annie, Helen and Russell for their fantastic presentations. And I personally look forward to the National Trust developing Blossom Watch so that it becomes a major cultural event on an annual basis in future. Thanks everyone, thanks for coming, and hopefully see you again at another of these webinars.